Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining FSMA Friday for April 2021. My name is Aaron Bolshaw, the moderator for FSMA Fridays, which, as some of you may know, of course, is an ongoing monthly industry update for food, beverage, facility operators, QA, safety, compliance professionals, really anybody on the floor, the plant floor. And SafetyChain teams up with the Acheson group to bring guidance and thought leadership on a host of topics revolving around Food Safety Modernization Act. JAG has been super generous this entire year through the pandemic by donating their time and talent for us. And today we are covering a full update on COVID infections, vaccinations, vaccines, and more. So we're excited to get that going. I want to make sure everyone understands that you're on mute, but we want to hear from you. We do like to hear and keep our ears open to what you guys are saying. Send us questions in the moderation panel or the webinar panel on your right. We're going to stay pretty tight to that 30-minute schedule today, so we may or may not get to a lot of questions because there's a lot of really great content that we'll go over. And it's my pleasure, of course, to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Ben Miller. Lots of industry experience, public health, food regulation, and food safety management. This is, everybody at TAG, it's exactly the people you want on your team, whether you just need consultation about how to do things right or better, or certainly, boy, if you get that recall or anything crazy like that happens, you want TAG on your side. So, Dr. Ben Miller, welcome.
Hey, Aaron, thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, so it's been a year. We're just talking. We're seeing a solid trend in the U.S., right? Especially in some states where there's been more assertive vaccination campaigns being rolled out. You see the CDC guidelines for mask mandates for outdoor, being outdoors, were updated just this week. We're seeing more now. I'm seeing more and more of our colleagues and family and friends getting fully vaccinated. But we see all these numbers, right? And they're gone. They're down. But we've seen this before, and I'll be honest, I'm a little hesitant to pop the champagne so far. Why don't you tell us, is a return to normalcy in sight?
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, I think that's the question everyone wants to know the answer to, and when do we get there? I think right now we're sort of in that phase where we're seeing, really good vaccine uptake across most parts of the country, and that's been a huge success story. We were talking before the webinar started here just about, we did this, it's been a year ago, and if I had projected into the future, would we be where we are now? I don't think that I would have been this optimistic. So we're in a good spot, but we're in that kind of transition space right now between a lot of people getting vaccinated, and what does that mean from kind of a case count standpoint, and what does that mean from kind of a dialing back some of the risk mitigation measure standpoint. So that's what I'm going to chat about today during the FSMA Friday here, and just put it in the context of sort of where we are now and where we're headed. So, as an overview, we're gonna, why do we still care about COVID-19? It seems like a question that doesn't need to be asked, but I think, we've been living with it now for 15, 16 months, and definitely there's fatigue out there, but why do we still kind of want to keep our attention up, at least for the next few months? Touch on herd immunity, and then, just do a little bit of background on vaccine safety and efficacy, and then talk about, what do these new variants mean? What are booster shots likely? And then, think about, when do we get back to normal? What does that look like? So with that, I will just kind of jump in. The Kaiser Family Foundation a couple months ago did an analysis, and, I think we've lived with this now, and so unfortunately, we become used to kind of the new normal, I guess, of living in a pandemic. But the reality is, and it's important to remember, we did see a lot of excess mortality associated with this outbreak, and they estimated that was like 10 times the amount of excess mortality that we would see with, a typical influenza strain. So the reality is, we've lived through the first global pandemic of a coronavirus. We knew what flu looked like. We knew generally how it would behave, and we're still learning about sort of the long-term implications of infections with COVID and coronavirus and SARS-CoV-2. So the reality is it impacted a lot of people, and it continues to do so. We're fortunate here in the US, but, if we look at other parts of the world, and this was kind of the outbreak curve coming out of India over the last few days, you know, I think it's a cautionary tale, and it's one that tells us too that we're still in the middle of a global pandemic, and we've been extremely fortunate through, the investments that we've made and the technology that we have and the infrastructure that we have in the US to be able to rapidly vaccinate, a significant portion of the population with some really effective and safe vaccines. It's important really that we get those out to the rest of the world. And the reason for that is that anytime you see infection rates like we're seeing in India right now, that just creates the opportunity for more transmissible variants. That's what viruses do. They generally tend to mutate and they become more infectious. They generally become less severe over time because from an evolutionary standpoint, that benefits them. But, with the numbers of cases that we're seeing in countries like India right now, and in parts of South America too, that still results in some significant morbidity and mortality. And what happens in those parts of the world is, again, only a plane ride away from, what we might have to contend with in the US this fall. So it's an important piece of the equation. And where do we sit right now in terms of, this concept around herd immunity, and something we've certainly heard a lot about, and it's herd immunity is really a function of the dynamics or the transmission dynamics of any virus. So you've probably heard about the reproductive number and R naught, and sort of what does that mean? Well, right now with a lot of the risk mitigation measures that we have in place, the R naught of the virus, especially like the B.1.1.7 variant, it's probably, right around 1.5. So, if you have somebody that's infectious, they're going to cause infection in about 1.5 additional people. As we start to dial back some of those risk mitigation measures like physical distancing and mask usage, that R naught value goes up. It could go up between 3 and 4 for some of these more transmissible variants in a susceptible population. And so that's why we need, so many people vaccinated in the population to really drive that reproductive number down below 1. When we get it below 1, then we start to see exponential decay in terms of the number of cases. So we've talked a lot about or thought a lot about exponential growth, and that's what we're seeing in India right now. If we're able to get to that level of vaccination in a population, and a population might be a workforce too. I think that's an important piece of the conversation, is that, we're talking about, state level and US level and global levels here, but, if you've got a fairly controlled population in a workplace that's 80-85% vaccinated, that's really going to allow you to think about dialing back some of those risk mitigation measures over time. And, just a brief recap on the vaccines that we have at our disposal here in the US. We have 3 that have been authorized so far, 2 mRNA vaccines, those are the Pfizer and the Moderna, and then 1 viral vector vaccine, which is the J&J. When we talk about vaccine efficacy, what does that mean? We're really comparing the rate of illness in a group of people that were studied in phase 3 clinical trials, those in a placebo group versus those in a vaccinated group, and comparing the rates at which those 2 groups got sick. The great news is that, these vaccines, all 3 of them, are very effective at preventing severe illness, the kind of illness that would require hospitalization or end in mortality. And, very, very, very low numbers of hospitalizations associated with those who've been vaccinated at this point. And we're learning more about the vaccines too, in terms of their ability to prevent transmission, and that's an important part of achieving herd immunity. These vaccines prevent infection, but in turn, it looks like they also lower the viral load in somebody who might be infected and vaccinated, and that's a key piece of the puzzle to limiting future transmission. What are some of the side effects of the vaccine? This is something that came out of an MMWR paper where they looked at about 1.5 million people that had been vaccinated with 1 or 2 doses, and this would have been right when those first mRNA vaccines were rolling out. And we do know probably a number of people on the call have been vaccinated and have experienced some of these side effects, especially after that second dose for these mRNA vaccines. So a lot of site injection pain, fatigue, headache, chills, fever. One question is, if you don't experience these side effects, does that mean it didn't work? Luckily, no. Some people just tend to experience these side effects more, and that actually tends to happen more in women and in younger people because the innate immune response just tends to be a little stronger in those populations, and so those are the people that experience more of the side effects. But the good news for the mRNA vaccines are that there haven't been really any significant adverse side effects that have been observed with those vaccines. A little bit different story, obviously, with the J&J vaccine, and we know about that just by tracking what's been going on in the media. Very rare instances of some very unique types of blood clotting that have been associated with that vaccine tend to occur more in women than men and those under the age of 50. It's the same vaccine platform as the AstraZeneca vaccine, so it's probably something similar between those adenovirus vaccine platforms that are causing this very rare thrombosis that occurs, in a very basically 1 in a million people. So very low occurrence rates, and that's probably why it didn't show up in the clinical trials. The clinical trial size for J&J was about 70,000 people. About half of that would have actually received the vaccine. So these very rare events generally don't show up in those clinical trials just based on the sample size. So, when the EU and FDA has looked at this and CDC, they made the determination that the benefit still far outweighs the risk of these vaccines. And now that this is a known side effect, it's something that can be monitored for and addressed. If somebody were to start to experience this kind of clotting. So that's the good news. And now J&J is back in use, and that's a single dose vaccine. So it's certainly more convenient depending on the population that you're looking at and trying to get vaccinated. Again, the good news is that these vaccines do work well. And this is another report out of CDC's MMWR that came out at the beginning of the month. When you look at this, looked at about 4,000 people in a variety of professions from mid-December to mid-March. When we looked at sort of the rate at which unvaccinated people contracted COVID versus those who are fully vaccinated, you're about, I think it's 34 times more likely to contract COVID if you're not vaccinated versus fully vaccinated in that population. And again, that included essential and frontline workers. So we know these vaccines work well in the real world, and that helps inform some of the decisions that we're going to be making over the course of the next several months as it relates to dialing back some of the risk mitigation measures that we've had in place for the last 14, 15, 16 months. These new variants are of some concern. The predominant one that we have in the US is now B.1.1.7. We do know it's more transmissible and that it does, in fact, a bit oddly cause more severe illness in people, especially it appears younger people. So good news is the vaccines that we have are still quite effective against that variant. There are some other variants that have demonstrated their ability to cause reduced vaccine efficacy. B.1.351 is an example. And we're looking at some emerging variants that are coming out of India, B.1.617, which may have some characteristics that also reduce vaccine efficacy as well and increase transmissibility. So again, what happens in other parts of the world is really key to how we're going to manage this outbreak and pandemic in the US over time as well. And it's likely, well, it's more than likely, vaccine boosters to address some of these new and emerging variants are already under development. And so we can certainly expect to see those made available probably in this next 6 to 12 months. Are there some storm clouds on the horizon? There could be, and I think this is where we have to certainly have a lot to be optimistic about, but it's good to also be realistic as well and just sort of keep the science in front of us as we're thinking about decisions. The variants, there are rising cases, right, in some parts of the world, and we know that vaccinating the world will take a significant period of time, probably 2 or 3 years before we're able to fully reach, all corners of the world just based on the healthcare systems that exist in certain parts of the world. Vaccine hesitancy is an issue. Certainly in the US, we're probably going to hit 50% fairly easily in terms of the adult population. The next 10% will probably require some education and outreach, and the remaining 40%, that might be a harder group to get. And so understanding what that means from a disease transmission standpoint in the population is going to be important. And then, where are we headed? Boosters, we've talked about that. I think those are going to be part of the equation. So think about it like, we're all encouraged to get our flu vaccine in the fall. It might be that we get our COVID vaccine in the spring for the foreseeable future. So this is likely to be an annual vaccine that we're going to be taking for a while, just given sort of where we sit from a global standpoint.
Yeah, so that's good. There's some real impact to our facilities, though. As we're managing plants, the food and beverage manufacturers certainly need to stay where we wanted to do a quick poll. We wanted to develop some data around this. So I'm going to actually pull up a poll for everyone, Dr. Miller, so that we can ask, what COVID protocols are you adhering to still in your facility? So this will appear on your screen. Excuse me. We want you to just answer. We don't know who you are or who's saying this or what, but we do encourage you to take a minute, take a look. So what COVID protocols is your facility using? Is it Ppe Checks? And you can select any or all of these. Wellness checks at shift start, environmental checks. This is like, if you've got fans. Remember, Dr. Miller, that CDC said, hey, if you got fans blowing across employees, you've got to be able to monitor that. Then some other environmental checks. So general EHS, right? Social distancing and advanced sanitation. Really curious to see where we're at. We've got about 50% of the people voting. We can get a few more. Where do you think this will land? What would surprise you if it would? Because we're going to show this really quick, Dr. Miller. What would surprise you?
That's a good question. I think the things that remain important to me, and we've seen this come out in terms of just sort of CDC guidance on like surface or fomite transmission. I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that fall away, in terms of what people are doing on a regular basis. But we'll see where kind of social distancing comes out. That's still, I think, a key part of the equation, and mask usage. Yep. So there we go.
Yeah, let's share this. So there it is. So we've got lots of, PPE and wellness checks are happening all over, right? So this is, the basics are there. We're getting a quick check before you walk into the facility. We're getting, our masks on and so forth. Social distancing still up. Advanced sanitation in the work area is still going on. Environmental checks, not so much. This is interesting. And I think I would guess this is mostly due to what type of facility, right? If you're in a cooler and you've got those fans blowing, you've probably had to do some things, whereas other facilities you may not have. So
yeah, and that may shift over time. That's really interesting, and I'm glad that we had a chance to do it. I think as some of those other risk mitigation measures may start to get dialed back or fall away, like physical distancing and mask usage, it's interesting because in my opinion, the environmental piece, the air monitoring, actually becomes more important. Do you have enough sort of fresh filtered air coming into that space to support the number of people that are in there? Because that's your kind of engineering control that helps ensure that we're all back to normal, right? But is there enough air in here to really protect people who might not be fully vaccinated? So that's going to be something to track over time, and I think that's one of the things that companies may want to kind of consider as they look forward to reducing some of these risk mitigation measures.
Yeah, I know we've seen a lot of our customers who, depending on which climate you're in, you're opening up those big bay doors. You're trying to get as much fresh air into your facility as possible, but sometimes that's just, you can't do that. You got bugs maybe, when
Right. Yep.
the colder air in the winter, all of that stuff is really going to affect that. So appreciate that, everyone, for taking a minute and giving us your poll. Dr. Miller, why don't you continue and talk about the risks here, right?
Yeah. I think companies have thought about kind of addressing that vaccine policy in different ways, right? There's education, there's encouragement, there's incentivizing, and then, finally at the end of that spectrum, there's mandating. I don't think we've seen a lot of, companies, especially in the food industry, move to that mandate end of the spectrum. There are some segments like colleges and universities that are definitely heading in that direction. They have a different risk profile. They're bringing a large number of people into a kind of a residential congregate living setting. So for them, that makes sense, just from a public health standpoint. I think where we see a lot of companies right now is in that educate, encourage, and incentivize spectrum. So incentivize might include like giving paid time off to go get vaccinated, um, sharing information via sessions like this around the vaccines, to address potential hesitancy. So, we're still very much in that space. I don't know that I see, the mandate end of the spectrum being used in a lot of, business settings at this point, just because it's just not historically kind of where we've gone with that from a public health policy standpoint in the US. So this will be something that we're going to watch over time and see kind of where things head. But for the time being, we're still strongly in that education and incentivize space.
Yeah.
All right, and then Aaron, maybe you can bump to the next slide for me.
Yeah, I think we got it. There you go.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, where do we sit, just in that trajectory of vaccination, and where might we expect to end up if we continue at the current rate? And I think that's the assumption that we have to play with, right? Is sort of, are we going to continue at that current rate? I would say not, but if we are, this is a kind of tool you can go to National Public Radio's website. We've got the link down there on the slide, and kind of see where things sit for any individual or particular state. We would expect to reach about 50% of the population that's fully vaccinated by mid-June. That's probably a reasonable time frame, and then the next bit becomes more interesting, I think. Do we get to that 70% mark by end of July? Do we get to 85% by the end of August? Probably not. I think that's where we're going to start to see some of that die off. And sort of, what does that mean from a community case rate standpoint? Much of that, again, will depend on the transmissibility of some of these variants that are circulating, as well as the risk mitigation measures that we keep in place from a public policy standpoint and from an employment place standpoint. I think we're seeing parts of the country start to dial those things back, no physical distancing or social distancing prohibitions, masks no longer required in settings. For the time being, the case rates in those areas have stayed down. Will that hold? I think that's a key part of this question, and something that, I know I'm going to be looking at in terms of, over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, are we start to see case rates move back up in some of those areas? Because, as we've talked about, that just changes the dynamics of viral transmission. So, if things stay on a good path, I think we will start to see really significant decreases in case rates by midsummer, and by mid to late summer, really be in a position to think about dialing back some of those risk prevention measures, in communities and in facilities themselves. Again, a lot of that's going to depend on what the vaccination rates are. And, it's important for people to know and understand their own populations in a facility. Is that population representative of the community? And is that kind of the marker that you're going to use to track your vaccination rates? I've, had different conversations with different companies, and everybody's kind of thinking about it slightly differently. Some want to survey and really know where their unique population sits on that vaccine spectrum, and others are willing to look at the community rate as a proxy for the vaccination rate in their office or their facility. And so, I think those are decisions that people are going to have to think about and make over time. Understanding those rates, will help address, what can we start and stop doing. I do think that, testing has really fallen by the wayside in terms of our current conversation. I think there's going to be a renewed interest in testing, once we start to dial back some of those risk mitigation measures. So once we stop, let's say we're all back inside and we're not wearing face masks anymore, how do we know? How do we monitor those that may not be fully vaccinated, to make sure that there's not the risk of pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic transmission happening. So while testing sort of off the radar right now, I think it is going to come back probably this fall too, as we head into what our traditional influenza season and kids go back to school and things like that. So
I think that's a really good point, Dr. Miller, because I think you'll also see along with that faster and less expensive tests. So things that we can see more quickly. Hey, do we have somebody that has presence of COVID virus pre-symptomatic, right? How can we find that sooner so we can keep them and quarantine them safer and sooner?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Let's see if we can, we've been talking about dialing back. That's kind of the phrase that I've kind of latched onto in terms of, where do we sit from that prevention standpoint. And this is kind of a continuum that we've thought about and developed at TAG. So, at level 5, you're going to continue to do the things you've been doing. Level 4, you might start to institute special conditions for people who are fully vaccinated. Level 3, generally, you're bringing more people back into indoor spaces, re-densifying, if you will. And then level 2 is kind of that easing of other restrictions. So that's that final step. You're coming into closer physical contact and eventually stopping use of face coverings. And level 1 is sort of the new normal, right? We've made these improvements to physical spaces. We're going to maintain those, right? We're going to maintain improved ventilation or air filtration and things like that. So, for us, we've come up with, I think, a fairly simple model that we're trying to, share with people who are interested, that looks at case rates and vaccination rates. And so ideally, you're knowing what the vaccination rates are for your employee population. But again, you can use community vaccination rates as a proxy for that. And then what are the community case rates that you're seeing? And these case rate cutoffs are lower than I think you'd expect to see with today in an unvaccinated population, but that's the point, right? We're going to want to see lower community case rates overall, especially as vaccination rates increase.
Yeah, that's the name of the game here, right, Dr. Miller? This is less people getting the virus, more people staying healthy. There's nothing more to it than that, and there's positive ways to achieve that. So we just have one question. We've got just 2 minutes, so I'm going to give you this one. It's an interesting question that comes up. This person asks, how accurate or dependable is the data we are being provided? Seems like we have seen issues with accuracy over the last 18 months. I'll start us off, but you're the doctor, so I'm going to hand it over to you. I think that the data sets have been stable. I think the way that the data has been interpreted is variable. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we kind of tripped and stumbled a little bit in terms of data collection. And interestingly, it was, I think, the journalistic community that stepped in to try to fill that void and did a good job doing it, and now a year into the pandemic in the US anyways, that data has started to be more regularly and consistently aggregated at kind of the state and federal level. So I think the data that are out there that are being reported are in the US is certainly reliable. We know other parts of the world struggle in different ways with data accuracy. Certainly, if we went back to the beginning of the conversation, India, it's probably 10% of the actual case counts are being reported at this point. So depends on what part of the world we're talking about, but I would trust the data that we're seeing coming out of the US right now.
Yep, good. One more and we'll wrap it up. How can an employer determine the vaccination rate while balancing medical privacy challenges? I think that's a great question. That's hard.
It is, yeah. And I would encourage people to go Google, EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They've got pretty good guidance out there on, what employers can and can't do in terms of asking about vaccine status. The EEOC says that asking about someone's vaccine status is not considered, a medical, like something, specific about their medical condition or something that's likely to um, indicate a disability. So that's a Cliff Notes version. I would strongly encourage anyone to go actually read the guidance from EEOC itself. I think some companies have tried to balance that by just anonymously surveying their workforce. You can send out an anonymous survey and you're getting pretty accurate data back, hopefully about where people sit in terms of have they been vaccinated or not. Because the important number, at least to begin with, is what's that population level number. Someone's individual vaccine status becomes relevant, if you have to do a close contact investigation. But, from an employment standpoint, you're really interested in what proportion of my workforce is vaccinated.
Well, that's a fantastic tactic. Thank you for that. There's a couple more questions we're not going to be able to get to, Dr. Miller, but we'll try and get these over to you because there are a couple of good ones. Hey, stay tuned. You know what? We've got a lot more resources and future events coming up, and we're going to stay on top of all this. We've got internal adulteration changes going on. We've got the food traceability list still kind of flowing out there. There's still a lot of FSMA to deal with. So we'll see you in some upcoming episodes. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Oh, always a pleasure, Aaron. Thanks. Have a good weekend.
All right, you too. Cheers.
Thanks.